to facilitate the discussion. And it's really good to have this happening just on the tail of midsummer. So, on behalf of everybody, our library is located in the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people, Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to the elders of past, present, and emerging. Sovereignty has never been ceded; it always was, and always will be Aboriginal land. And here we also acknowledge First Nations people's rich history of knowledge keeping and knowledge management. That's of course an inspiration to all of us. Just a bit of topic admin points. If you need the bathrooms, you can go either this door or back through the main door, and they're basically on the other side of that wall there. And in the event of emergency, we have 2 emergency exits. One is exactly back out where you came through and down the stairs, and the other one is through this door and to the end of the passageway. Of course, if there's any sort of emergency, our staff will make sure you get out of the building safely. This year we celebrate a momentous occasion. It marks our library's 170th anniversary. We were formed in 1854 and we're the 2nd oldest library in Victoria. We have a collection of over 40,000 items and take great pride in being the only library in Australia with such an extensive collection relating to Victorian history and available to loan, covering a vast array of topics. Our focus is very much on local history, housing a wealth of information that encompasses most towns throughout Victoria. So Ellen and Lauren will be taking photographs and video. There's Ellen getting the camera there, taking photographs and videos for promotional purposes, and also in case you want to revisit the talk or tell your friends about it, you can watch it through our YouTube channel as well. If you prefer not to be included in any sort of filming or photography, please let us know. We're very pleased and we're very fortunate to have these 3 fabulous authors with us tonight. Again, as I said, just at the tail end of Midsummer Festival. So I, again, welcome Dr. David Gould and Dr. Wayne Murdoch. They're authors who both covered Australian social history and queer history in their recent books, which are down on the table at the bottom, so do have a look later on. First one being Kamp Melbourne in the 1920s and 30s, Queans and Inverts, and the other book, Survivors and Thrivers, Male Homosexual Lives in Post-War Australia. So tonight they're going to be interviewed, if you like, by Graham Willett, who's going to draw out from our authors some first-hand stories and some lived experiences of men of their time, and also our authors' research methodology and how they went about developing these books. So please make them very welcome.
Okay, thank you all for being here. We're going to try without the microphone. If you can't hear us, wave. Did anyone not hear that?
Use the microphone for the camera.
Gotcha. Okay, we're not going to try without the microphone. Okay, my name's Graham Willett.
I think so.
My name's Graham Willett. I am a historian and an archivist, non-academic archivist, and I volunteer with the Australian Queer Archives, and I help publish both of these books and various others at Queer Oz Folk, which specialises in Australian queer history. As mentioned, we're just going to sort of float some questions, try some answers. We'll certainly have time at the end for questions, so store them up and have them ready to go. I wanted to talk a little bit about queer history, and here the kind of language question comes up. What do we call ourselves? I usually go for queer now just because it's shorter. I've noticed that the alphabet string has just got longer in the last 2 weeks. So I'm really, really committed to queer, which was started to be used in the 90s, was reclaimed as a kind of radical name, and now just is a sort of shorthand for talking about the diverse range of people and identities that constitute the queer community. The identity question will come up during this talk, I think, and how people see themselves, the language they use, the meanings they ascribe to that. And as we'll see, although these two books occupy very similar historical periods, Wayne will be talking about the 20s and 30s, and David about the 40s and 50s. There are really remarkable shifts in that period, which until quite recently we tended to just dismiss as everything before gay, everything before 1970. It's very clear now that that was not an accurate account of those periods. And discovering that and working out how that worked is something that we see these books and the broader project as committing to. So I'm going to start with some of the stuff about how do we know this stuff? How is it that we've started to discover the kinds of lives people were living, which are different often to the ways that we assumed they did? I'll get Wayne to start and then we'll pass to David.
Thanks, Graham. So my book, Kamp Melbourne, Trade, Queers and Inverts, grew out of my PhD studies at University of Melbourne about 10 years ago now. And I was interested in actually exploring what the lived experience was like for men who were attracted to other men in Melbourne in the 20s and 30s. And of course, even at the time when I started doing my research 10 years ago, anyone who was actually active on the scene at that time had gone. So I wasn't able to actually undertake any oral history interviews. However, the Australian Queer Archives had actually been interviewing men and women from the 1980s onwards, and there were some transcripts of interviews with people who were active on the Melbourne scene in the 1920s and particularly in the 1930s. So I had some oral history to draw on. But what I mainly used was actually published sources, and the sources that were actually, funnily enough, created to actually persecute and prosecute gay men in the 1920s and 30s. And that's things like criminal trial briefs and prison registers, etc. So it's actually very much working from, it's actually looking at the material that's produced by the dominant society, but actually reading between the lines. And those of us who were gay pre-1990s, when there was a queer media, etc., are very good at reading between the lines. We can find the stories of people like us that are hidden in the mainstream stuff. And so I started using criminal trial briefs particularly because they contain things like witness statements. And even though they're produced by a prosecuting society or a prosecuting entity, you can actually tease stories out from there and actually find out what was going on in Melbourne in the 1920s and 30s, listen to the voices of people describing themselves, the way they talk about themselves, the language they use, the slang they use, and also build a geography of the city. So you know what's happening, where it's happening. I think we can actually talk a little bit more about that down the track. I won't actually take too many spoilers just yet.
Okay, David, you had a very different experience. Despite, as I say, it's a slightly later period, it's a very different way of doing the research.
Yes, I suppose one of the things that was easier for me was that I had access in the end to quite a number of men, 27 homosexual men who volunteered to be interviewed by me about their lives. And I guess the difference with what Wayne was able to do was the fact that when I was interviewing them and they were explaining about their lives, they were able to go into detail, and I was able to ask them questions to follow up whatever they were saying. So it was, I guess, much more direct and first-hand experience of people compared with the sort of documents that Wayne had to use. However, having said that, some of the same things still came out because, of course, Wayne used a lot of documents that came from the criminal courts, And I also read a lot about criminal courts, but also about other things that we'll talk about later on, including, for example, the media. So I did also look at documents and use them as a backup for what I was actually hearing from the men. But I suppose in the end, it was the voice of the men that I wanted to really project into my book, because I think they placed such a huge amount of trust in me in telling me about their lives. And you have to remember that this is not something that was easy for them to do. It might be easy for us now to be sitting here and talking about homosexuality, but it certainly wasn't in the 1940s and 50s. In fact, it would have been unheard of, and certainly, of course, in the 1920s and 30s also. So the very fact that we're sitting here indicates the, if you like, progress that we have made, but also tells us about the history and where we have come from.
Which kind of raises just a question of how close do you think you got to the experiences of these men in a way that David was able to by asking them?
There are limitations with using something like criminal trial briefs and that sort of documentation. I did use newspaper accounts as well, and they were quite interesting. But one of the things with the criminal trial records, which are held by the Public Records Office in North Melbourne, is that it also includes not just witness statements and other sort of, court documents, but also evidence files. And so in those evidence files, you'll find there's a beautiful set of love letters from 1919 between two men who were arrested, and then it was found that there was no evidence to actually convict them on, apart from a wad of letters about this thick between the two of them. And one of the guys was so organised, he not only kept the letters from his lover, but he also kept all of his own carbon copies. So there's two-way conversation between men. You'll often, there are other things in those evidence files. There are photographs. Oh dear, there are photographs. There's an appointment diary in one of them, and then there are sometimes lists of pieces of evidence that have been kept which have no longer survived, like a shirt tail that has suspicious stains on it, etc. That's no longer there, but it's on a list that says it was once. So in things like the letters from 1919, you're actually getting the voices of the people, and they're not just giving a statement to the police. This is a conversation between two men. And what they think of each other, what they feel for each other. So it is, you get the most, you do sometimes get just really, really primary material from that sort of stuff. And you just love to interrogate them a little bit more and just ask, what were you thinking at the time? But you can't.
David, did anyone knock back your requests to interview them?
Yes, I did have a few who knocked back the requests, and that was without explanation, which was perfectly fine, of course. But one does stick in my mind particularly, and it was, I think, a man of about 90 who contacted me, and he was very unsure about whether he wanted to go ahead with the interview. So I invited him to have a coffee with me, and I said to him I would explain what I was doing. And then there would be absolutely no pressure. He could make a decision at the end of that whether he wanted to go ahead or not. So we had coffee and we had a lovely time talking for about an hour. And then at the end of it, he said to me, look, I don't really think I can go ahead with this because the government might find out. And that was because he was living with his male partner, and he still had this fear from the 1940s and 50s that somehow the government was going to find out that they were in this homosexual relationship. And I don't know what he thought they would do, but he was very afraid of that. And for that reason, he declined.
Okay, so you can see that you're getting a lot of information. Nobody gets everything. And that would be true today if you were interviewing people. People tell their stories in particular ways. One of the things seems to me that both of you have in common is that this is a period of the criminalisation and the vilification of homosexuality. It's against the law for men to have sex with men. It's against the law for one man to proposition another. And after 1961 in Victoria, it's against the law to hang around in a public place on the off chance you might get a chance to proposition somebody. So they kind of got you coming and going, as it were. These laws, of course, date back to 1533 and King Henry VIII, not the obvious defender of morals, wife murdering and so on. But nonetheless, they arrived in Australia, and over the course of the 19th century, the penalties were reduced from death down to sort of 10 years of flogging and so on, but extended in terms of what counts as sex between men. But the policing, the court system, all of this stuff is really essential background to this period. David, how did people think about that when they talked about it?
Yes, in my period, after the Second World War, it was a time of great change, of course. The war had brought a number of changes in society, and people were very aware of what it meant to be a man, or supposedly what it meant to be a man. And a lot of that centred around manhood, self-respect, being mature, certainly marrying, bringing up a family, being strong, supporting your wife, supporting your children. And so homosexual men, of course, largely didn't fit into that category. And so the very definition of being heterosexual was the opposite of homosexual. It was not being homosexual. And men, of course, who were homosexual, therefore didn't fit the bill. But it was even bigger than that, because not only did they not fit the bill to create family and create stability and create wealth for the country, they were also seen to be a threat to the country because of, well, in America certainly, they were seen to be in bed with communists, which wasn't really the case here in Australia, but they were certainly seen to be morally repugnant and dangerous to children. So the very environment that the men found themselves in after the Second World War meant that being homosexual was dangerous, and that you had to be very secretive about it, because your life could depend on it.
And over there?
Well, I have to say in the 20s and 30s, although sex between men was actually illegal, and in 1919, Victoria introduced its version of the La Bouchière Amendment, which was the 1885 legislation in the UK that made any sexual contact between men illegal. Previously, it was either sodomy or attempted sodomy, but it introduced the new law, the new offence of gross indecency, and that was any sexual contact between men. So that's 1919, that comes into law in Victoria. So through the 20s and 30s, it is illegal, obviously, for men to have sex, or any kind of sex. However, I actually find in the 20s and 30s, due to a number of reasons, one of them being a relative naivety on the part of the populace in general about the whole issue of homosexuality. People just aren't aware. The man and woman in the street are obviously just not aware of homosexuals amongst them. It's very closeted, it's very quiet. There are no, publicly known meeting places, etc. The tabloid press occasionally have a bit of a, moral panic about what's going on, but of course they paint that in such lurid terms that people don't actually think that relates to anyone they actually know. And so there's a degree of naivety on the part of the populace about homosexuals and what they do and all the rest of it. And that feeds into a sort of a feeling on the part of the the police, the government, the judiciary, etc., where, let's not actually talk about this, because it's going to actually let people know that this happens. And if you tell people about it, they might actually want to try it. So let's just not say anything. And so right through the 20s and 30s, the police don't actively go out, looking for gays, not like the 50s and 60s when the police were active in entrapping men in beats and public toilets, etc. In the 20s and 30s, the number of prosecutions per year is actually quite low. And people get in trouble with the police because the police fortuitously find them in a compromising position, or a nosy landlady reports someone to the police, or someone sees something that they don't like and reports it to the police. But the police aren't actively going out looking for homosexuals. And so I think in the 20s and 30s, if you kept your head down, your mouth shut, you could actually probably get by without attracting too much attention. It's a very different period to post-war.
I just want to make a comment about what Wayne was saying there. I think another shift when we moved to the 1940s and 50s, and particularly the 50s after the war, was that homosexuality was considered a mental illness also. And whilst that may have been the case in the 20s and 30s, in the 40s and 50s, I think it was magnified. And the reason for that was that after the war, there were a lot of men and women also who came back from the war who were not only physically scarred, but mentally scarred. And so the importance of psychology and psychiatry rose because of that. And people became very aware of those who were suffering from mental illness. It was then very convenient to place homosexuality into the category of a mental illness, which was just another reason to demean it and to be able to take men to court charged with the abominable crime of buggery. And so those sorts of issues grew out of the fact that mental illness was connected with homosexuality.
It just struck me then that, in fact, both of your books deal with male homosexuality, sex between men, or their identities or their experiences. The absence of women is due to
me being a gay man, not being equipped, not being just like not my topic. I'm sorry, I couldn't do it justice, and I shouldn't be doing it justice. I will leave that to other researchers.
Dave?
Yes, I guess the reason for me not doing the women's side of things was that at the very beginning of my PhD, which my book grew out of, I had thought about doing that. In fact, I did interview 2 lesbian women, but by the time I started the actual thesis, my supervisor and I decided that it would be too hard to do that. Number one, because the women's story, I believe, should be told by women. But secondly, it would involve going into very deeply into feminism and other topics that perhaps my topic was not going to cover. So it was a question of how much you could cover within a certain period of time, I guess. But certainly, I think the women's story remains to be told for the 40s and 50s, and hopefully that will happen soon.
The other thing we say, of course, is that sex between women was not illegal. And thank Queen Victoria for that if you want to. There's this myth goes around that it was they couldn't bring themselves to tell her that it was possible. This is her advisors. Or alternatively, they did tell her, but she didn't believe it. None of this is true, but it makes for good stories, which I guess raises the question of good stories, the extent to which both of these books are really lively tellings, and I wondered how important that was to the research and the writing.
Very important, very important. I mean, I looked at the legal background to the whole, to male homosexuality in the 20s and 30s. I looked at the medicalisation of homosexuality. Basically, 1919, it was still a hangover from the Victorian period where it's actually a sin. You know, anyone could do gay sex if they were just, you know, perverted or mad enough. But it doesn't actually necessarily mean it's something of, you know, it's not a sexual identity. And I also looked at, you know, societal attitudes. But to make that stuff come alive, I was looking at lived experience. You know, how do people navigate the law, the medical attitudes, the social attitudes, the religious attitudes at the time, and live their lives. Some of them living good lives, some of them living absolutely appalling lives. But how do people navigate society in order to live their life? And that's where the good stories come out. I created a geography of gay, or camp, as I called it, Melbourne in the 20s and 30s. I looked at where men were meeting, where men were socialising, where they were congregating. I looked at how they recognised each other, the various types of clothes they used. And there's a beautiful story. Hal Porter, the writer, in one of his autobiographical books, mentions in the 1930s he bought a camel hair coat from Henry Bucks and immediately realised that he was imposing on the uniform of another group because it was what every best dressed homosexual in Melbourne was wearing at the time. So he pawned it to actually buy a frock for a female friend. I'm reading this thinking, hell mate, you're disingenuous here, you're lying, because everyone knows you were gay. But he gives this beautiful description of the types of clothing: camel hair coats, suede shoes, paisley scarves, that you know the well-dressed homosexual of 1934 Melbourne was wearing. But other amazing stories. And I was talking to Graham and David just before. I found today a cache of photos taken in 1929 of the inside of the toilets at Flinders Street railway station. The lavatory attendant noticed 2 sets of feet under the door of a cubicle in the railway station one evening and burst the door open and found one man giving another man oral sex. And it's a beautiful line because the guy, Tom Dillon, who was actually being sucked off, actually said to the lavatory attendant, "I wish you'd come along a little bit earlier. This is lovely." But anyway, they were interrupted. He called the police came. And then the police took detailed photographs of the insides of the lab. There, you know, all the lovely subway tile, etc. It's there. There's photographs of the gap under the door. There's photographs of what you can see into the cubicle above the door. If you ever want to actually restore Flinders Street public toilet, Flinders Street station toilets, you've got source material right there.
David, you're telling stories as well as reflecting on their lives. How much weight does that give to the book?
So one of the issues that I had to tackle early on in terms of writing my book was thinking about the issue of truth and what truth means, and is it different for all different people? And also the fact that these men who I was interviewing, who were all between the ages of 74 and 95, they all had different levels of memory, as we all do. And so there was the question of whether or not the stories that they were telling me, was this truth or was this recalled truth? And I suppose I came to the conclusion that in fact it didn't really matter, because what I was doing was hearing their stories, listening to them explain their lives, and in fact interpreting, they were interpreting what their lives were and what their lives meant and where they found meaning. And so the issue of truth didn't seem to me as important in terms of trying to define that. But what I found was that there seemed to be, to me, 3 different communities. And the first community was in fact no community. So these were the men who had absolutely no idea that other homosexual men existed. And so they led lives that were completely isolated and completely lonely, and also believing that they were mentally unstable and criminals, basically. The second group I call precarious communities, and this was because these were the men who did have some sense of what homosexuality could mean, but largely it centred around their desire for homosexual sex. And so they went looking for that in beats, usually gardens, public toilets, or beaches, places like that. And so those men had some knowledge that communities did exist, but nevertheless there was nothing social about that, because in fact going to a bed was most often not only a fearful thing to do, but also a very dangerous thing to do. But then the third part, the third community, was what I called social communities, and that was really important because I think, as Graham mentioned, the 1940s and 50s have always been looked upon in the past as being a very dark period for homosexuals, and certainly it was for many of the men who lived at that time. But there were nevertheless a minority of men in my studies, so about 7 of 27, who were able to make contact with other homosexuals and who in fact had a ball. They were able to have lots of sex, they had lots of parties, they were able to meet other men in bars, and they were able to do things under the cover, if you like, of normal, or in inverted commas, normal society. And as Wayne pointed out, most people didn't think that homosexuality impacted them in the sense that they thought they didn't know any homosexuals. So homosexuals who were out to a degree were able to make their own lives and enjoy them.
I'll get Wayne to talk in a minute about the title of his book about the 20s and 30s, which is Trade, Inverts.
Trade, inverts, and
Yeah.
yes.
Do you think about that?
Yes,
I'll come back to you.
trade, inverts, yes.
Do you think that your men presented themselves differently, as well as belonging to these different kind of communities? Do you think that affected the way they dressed, socialised, and so on?
I don't think they did, certainly not when they were within heterosexual community. I think they presented or tried to present as, if not heterosexual, certainly they kept their homosexuality secret. So it was very, you had to be very particular at work, within social situations. You had to be particular about the topics that you talked about. You had to be particular about who you talked about and with whom you were speaking. So for that reason, I think that probably men were able to, as I said, live under the cover, but have these two lives. So they had their homosexual life and they also had their work life. But just to give you an example of how dangerous it could be, one man I interviewed who was an executive in his working life told me the story of another man within the office who was very high up also, but it was discovered that he was homosexual. And the next morning when he walked into his office, the word "pufta" was painted across his office door and he was gone by lunchtime because he was homosexual.
Which actually raises the question, how do they find each other? These days it's not hard. In your period, there are ways of doing it, but it's not you.
Those who were, in the modern term, out, were able to gather in places like the Australia Hotel, which was in Collins Street in Melbourne, and there were other hotels around also that homosexual men knew about. So they largely gathered in places like that, although it was difficult because, of course, in those days there was 6 o'clock closing. So you had to be able to get back on the train to get back to your home. And also there weren't as many trains and they lived in suburbs and most of them didn't have cars, etc. So it was much more difficult to meet. But they did meet in hotels and they also met in private parties and private houses. Even when they were at private parties, they had to make sure that they knew who was coming, and they used to keep an eye out in case the police raided the place. And I did hear about parties that were raided by police, and generally everyone just ran for it if they did come.
Whereas your lot are much more likely to be identifying and identifiable.
Yes, I think the fact that the police weren't as vigilant in persecuting or entrapping homosexual men in the 20s and 30s, the beat culture at the time was actually fairly different, or different in some ways, to what happened post-war. So I've come across several cases where men have actually met at a beat. I've got a lovely case from 1919 where two men meet at the Lobster Pot, as it was called, on the corner of Swanston and Lonsdale Street outside the old Queen Victoria Hospital. They picked each other up there, but they didn't actually have sex there. They actually walked all the way down Swanston Street and across Princess Bridge to the Alexandra Gardens. So they've had 6 blocks worth of conversation before they actually get to the Alexandra Gardens, have sex, but then actually decide they like each other so much that they go out for dinner at Sargent's Cafe in Swanston Street, which is just opposite the town hall, and then start up a relationship that goes for about 12 months. So the beat often, in the 20s and 30s, the beat often actually acted as your entree to this hidden world. And once you actually got to know, and beats were all over Melbourne. It wasn't just central Melbourne. They were in every suburb. And I think beat users would have recognised other regulars. Sometimes you'd chat, sometimes you'd hang around outside and talk for hours, etc., etc. It was often an entree into this hidden world. And I've got numerous cases where that has happened. There were 2 guys who actually met in the toilets at Caulfield Racecourse every Saturday afternoon for about 3 years before the police actually rumbled them. And that's the other thing actually I want to say. Using criminal records, everyone thinks, it's easy to think, oh, these are horrible stories, these are dreadful stories, this is all gone badly. But the prosecution, that single prosecution, is the tip of the iceberg. If 2 guys get caught in a beat, it's not the first time 2 guys have ever actually met at that beat. There's a lot of other people who've been there before them. This is just the one occasion where it comes to light. And the fact that it actually has come to light means that we actually know something was going on there. So yeah, I think in the 20s and 30s, that whole beat culture was your start. There was even in the 30s, there were hotels, as David says. The Hotel Australia opened right towards the end of the 1930s and immediately was one of the popular places to go. There were other pubs, there were coffee shops, there were cafes. Tate's Coffee House in the basement of the Manchester Unity building was a very upmarket sort of a cafe, and during the day it was popular with matrons from the suburbs in town for shopping. But on Saturday nights, it was taken over by the camp crowd, who would smuggle their own booze in, drink it out of teacups, and actually engage in sing-alongs. And the staff, fine, the staff tolerated this. And in 1938, there was actually a camp cabaret in Elizabeth Street, upstairs, above a cafe, that was actually raided by the police, who they raided it for offences against the liquor licensing laws. That's how they actually got it. But when they burst in, there was a full-on drag cabaret going. Now, everybody who was there was actually a member of a social group. So these just weren't one-offs in off the street. These were people who knew each other and who operated in a sort of social milieu.
I'm trying to work out if on balance life was bad or good. Could you have lived in that period? How would you have negotiated that period? Do you want to try?
Oh, yeah. If I knew then what I know now, yes, I think so. I jokingly say, drop me on any street corner in Melbourne in 1910 and I know where I can go for fun.
I think perhaps the 1940s and 50s was very different to what Wayne has described because, of course, as I mentioned before, 1940s and 50s, there's this fear that creeps in and the whole mental illness, etc. And so men were very afraid of going out and acting on their desire. So from that point of view, I think probably the 40s and 50s were even harder than what Wayne's period was.
Yeah, one of the things I liked about these two books is that there's no smooth flow, really. They're not the same period, but they also don't just lead logically one to the next, which for me raises one of the questions, what happened to those kind of subcultures? Because it seems to me by the time you get to the 70s, things really have changed.
Yeah, in fact, I'm not sure I know the answer to that question, but I do know that in the 50s, because of that fear, that it was driven underground and it was very hard for people to create these communities. And in fact, even the social communities that I talk about in terms of men meeting together in pubs or in private houses, it wasn't like they were creating an identity, I don't think, not identity in the sense of what we would talk about in modern times. I think what they were doing essentially was just socialising and finding other people who were like themselves. But in terms of any sort of political sense of themselves as being a group, and that there might have been hundreds and thousands of them, I don't think that was actually the case. And that probably started perhaps in the late 60s, I'm not sure, that's more Graham's period, but it certainly wasn't the case in the 40s and 50s.
And your generation?
Difficult to say. I think, at a remove of 100 years now, it's difficult to actually project onto people how they perceive themselves. I think, as David said earlier, there would have been a lot of men in the 20s and 30s who were very isolated, who thought they were the only one. But I think if you hadn't into the subculture in the 20s and 30s, I don't think anyone was actually thinking too much about, identity as such. It was mainly a case of finding people who felt the same way you feel, socialising with those people, building friendship networks, etc., or just getting off if that's what you need to do. I think it's difficult to actually back project, and I don't think we should back project, but you always do. Interesting question, but David's got something to say.
I just wanted to add there that despite the fact that it was very difficult for many men, most of them, those who were comfortable with their sexuality, they were often able to express that in ways to each other that the heterosexual population was not seeing, even though it was there in front of them. And a story that comes to mind is that one man told me that a lot of homosexual men used to love Moomba because they could dress up and get on the floats and be waving at people as they went by. And he said that he knew, watching it, that there were lots and lots of homosexual men on these floats, but the heterosexual population just thought they were men who were having fun.
That's certainly what I thought. Okay, just to kind of spring this on you, what's the most interesting or the best or the worst story that comes out of your research for you?
Yeah, for me, it's an easy answer, but also a difficult one because it was one of the really, I think, the saddest story that I heard. One man who I've since heard has passed away. He contacted me and he lived in the countryside near Bacchus Marsh, actually, but he wanted to meet me in his house that he had in Sunshine. And when he took me into the kitchen, it was full of boxes and papers and things. And he then told me the story of how he had been arrested at a beach in the 1950s. And he had never, in fact, in his whole life, he never told anyone he was homosexual to the day that he died. And he told me that he had been arrested and he was in a huge panic about this because what was he going to do? Because it would come out publicly. And he was advised that he needed to get a solicitor, which he did. But a few days before the trial, he found out that the solicitor was basically an alcoholic and that he needed to change or he would lose. So he had to get himself a barrister. Now, this is in the 1950s, he was a farmer. I don't think he would have had a lot of money, and a barrister would have cost a lot of money. But anyway, he got a barrister, and he only met that barrister on the day that he was going to court. And he told me that when he met the barrister in the morning, just before they went into court, the barrister said to him, "I want you to go into that court and say one thing and one thing only, guilty." And he said, "But I don't want you to say that because the police who entrapped me and bashed him very badly." He said, "It was their fault. I didn't do anything wrong." And the barrister insisted that he go in and plead guilty because he said the judge would fine him and that would be it. So he went into the court and the judge found him guilty and fined him, and it was going to come out publicly. And the next day, he rang the barrister in a panic and said, "What am I going to do now?" And the barrister's response was, "But you pleaded guilty." And then at the end of telling me this story, this man pointed to a box on the kitchen floor and he said to me, "That box is my life." I feel quite emotional telling it now. He was destroyed by it, and he didn't say, but I'm pretty sure that he had a complete breakdown after that. So it was a very sad story.
And it is, of course, often those personal stories that really bring home just how bad this was. We could talk about laws and attitudes and psychiatry and so on, but it's the impact on people's lives that is something we need to remember. Just shifting pace a little bit. Wayne's been talking a lot about his book on the 20s and 30s, Kamp Melbourne. I had it in my head, Trade, Queens and Inverts.
Queens and Inverts.
So it's identifying different kind of characters and identities that people developed. That's not available here because it's unbelievably expensive.
Very expensive.
And we're trying to extract it.
Damn UK publishers.
Yes, that's at Cambridge University Press, which is not Cambridge University Press. Cambridge Scholars Press. His previous book is, however, available, The Mystery of the Handsome Man. And I thought,
That was the second one. That's what I've been doing since.
that's right, just testing.
Yes.
That is what I said. Do you want to tell us about that?
Okay, so The Mystery of the Handsome Man tells the story The Mystery of the Handsome Man tells the story of John Lempriere Irvine, there's a name to conjure with, who was a bon vivant, sporting champion, rowing, and member of the establishment in 19th century Tasmania and Victoria. And he actually lived his best life for about 50 years, from the 1840s to the 1890s. and came unstuck in 1897 when his secret life caught up with him. I don't want to give too much away, but I've called it the history of the handsome man, because here is a man from the heights of Tasmanian society. His parents did amazing things. He had a beautifully documented life for 50 years, from 1847 when he was born at Port Arthur, because his father was second in charge of the penal colony there, right through to Melbourne through the boom years of the 1880s and into the 1890s. A beautifully documented life. I was able to trace what he was doing every month for 50 years. And then suddenly he propositions the wrong person in the street and disappears. And I wondered, and I could find no trace of him after 1897. Well, should I? Yes. Okay. Well, I'm going to have to write an addendum to it, or a final chapter, because just over the Christmas holidays, I discovered what happened to him. When I did the launch, and I was saying, okay, right, it's 1847 to question mark, because I don't know what happened to him. One of the guys in the audience at the launch, actually, in the question and answer section at the end, put his hand up and said, do you think it was an honour killing on the part of his family because they were so horrified that they had a homosexual in the family? I thought, no, that's not what members of the Tasmanian establishment did in the 1890s. They didn't actually do honour killings and stuff. But I figured he'd moved overseas, and just over the Christmas holidays, I actually found out where he went to. And you can ask me later on about that, because I think I have to write a final chapter of his further adventures overseas.
Don't be put off buying this edition. We'll make sure you
It's still a really good read. It's a good story.
And we'll make sure you get the addendum if you leave the details with us. So we've now got time for people to ask questions, make comments, and there's one already.
Thank
Do we need to
you.
move this around?
No, it's okay.
I'll
Okay.
try and shout.
Shout.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting, both of you. David, one thing occurred to me while you were talking. Did any of your interviewees marry a female? And I want to ask our other speaker, was there anything that really surprised you that came out of your research? And maybe David too, because I can't speak that. What did you expect?
Yes, 7 of my 27 men did marry, and the reasons were varied. About 2 or 3 of them married because they believed that they were in love with their wives and they did want to marry. And those marriages lasted for approximately 15 years. And in fact, one of the men I interviewed, who's still alive, still lives with his wife, but he also lived with a male lover in the same house. The other men who married did so because of family pressure, and often it was very difficult for them, if you like, to get out of those marriages, and they often ended not very well. But it wasn't the case, I don't think, that all homosexual men despised the institution of marriage. Some of them did want it and did try very hard, but I guess in the end their true selves came through in the sense that they wanted to be homosexual, and that meant that they couldn't be within a heterosexual marriage.
And just picking up on your question about something that surprised me when I was doing my research, in addition to all the criminal stuff and newspapers, etc., I also looked pretty closely at a lot of biographies, autobiographies, self-published autobiographies, the small press stuff, through that was published mainly in the 1980s and 90s of people who were looking back at their lives in Melbourne in the 20s and 30s. And I found a couple of biographies of, straight people who mentioned gay men that they had known in the 20s and 30s. And what surprised me was their attitudes to them at the time. You always think, it's a long time ago, everybody was very anti. But there's a lovely story of Fairleigh Taylor, who was a teacher at, I think, Presbyterian Ladies College, was living in Chequers boarding house in East Melbourne, which is now the National Trust's Tasman Terrace. In the 30s, her marriage had broken down, so she'd moved into this boarding house, which was quite a respectable place. But one of the fellow tenant or lodgers there, I've forgotten his name, John. Anyway, she mentions in her autobiography that he was one of the most popular people there, and he was the winner of a male beauty competition. I thought, okay, I have to actually find this out. And it turns out he was the state finalist for Victoria in a Paramount Pictures Search for Beauty competition in 1933. So Paramount scoured the Anglosphere, England, America, Australia, Canada, South Africa. They're looking for the most beautiful man and the most beautiful woman from all of these places. Anyway, so it was a huge thing in 1933 and big write-ups in the Women's Weekly and all sorts of things. And this guy, John, I forget his surname, was the winner. And so I was actually able to marry up this oblique reference in Fairleigh Taylor's biography with an actual real person, found his photo in The Age, etc., etc. But she also tells the story that his best friend, and I can remember the best friend's name, it was Joe McCubbin. Joe McCubbin was well liked by everybody, but he was a lovely fellow, except when he got drunk. And he'd come home and he'd make a lot of noise walking into the place. Anyway, one night she's in her room and she could hear Joe McCubbin stumbling up the stairs outside. And then suddenly, he's making all this noise, and then suddenly dead silence, except for this slithering sound. And she opens a door and he's crawling past her room because she'd already told him off in the past for making noise. So this time he's actually got enough presence of mind to actually crawl past her room. And she tells the story about John and Joe as, these are just two people that were in the boarding house I lived with and everybody liked them. And it's obvious they're a couple. She doesn't mention that, but, again, read between the lines. They're a couple. So I think one of the things that really surprised me was people's, the ordinary person's attitude. And it's kind of like, it's the old thing. Homosexuals, horrible people. But, Uncle Fred's okay.
Was he beautiful?
In a very brilliantine 1930s kind of way, yes.
Okay, other questions?
Perhaps a comment, but you might want to make an observation about it. Yesterday was Valentine's Day. I was listening to ABC Radio. I don't know if any of you have heard this. And they had a representative from the Australian War Memorial talking about documentation. Did you hear the interview?
I'm thinking very seriously of signing up to do transcription.
Yes, yeah. And they were talking about love letters that were written from troops to their sweethearts. And they read out a couple of them, which were just heartrending. But they also had a representative from the Queer Archives. I can't remember who it was.
Nick Henderson.
Was it?
Nick.
Oh, you're back there.
Hello. I'm telling your story now. You probably tell it much better than me. It was great hearing you, Nick, because what was really interesting was you were saying, I'm embarrassed now, that you were saying that the men were degendering their communications, and Defence were onto it, even I think you said up to the 70s.
Yep.
And it was particularly for lesbians, but it also included gay men. And so degendering their communications. She talked about how do you identify with each other and how do you write. And I thought that was just so sad, but at least they could have that communication. It's very interesting, so I don't know if you want to comment on that in terms of using documentation for your research.
Yeah. Oh, that actually just reminds me of, and again, I think Nick knows more about this than I do, but when Victoria Museum was actually doing some work on an archaeological dig or exploration of the exhibition buildings in Carlton Gardens, which were used during the war by the Air Force, I think it was. They found masses of stuff under the floorboards, but lots of letters. And I think, Graham, you sent them to me, or the museum sent them to you, and you sent them on to me, sort of saying, is there anything in this? And I think there were about 3 letters between 2 men at who were stationed at the exhibition buildings, and it was very hard to read what was going on. There was a bit of it that could have been communications between 2 men who were actually together, or it could have been 2 straight guys who were actually just winding each other up. And and I think you sent them to me saying, what do you think of these? And I had to say, look, I've got no idea. I think they might have been love letters, or communicating with each other, or they might have actually been straight guys winding each other up. It was really hard to read what the meaning was. So yeah, there's all sorts of those tantalising clues around.
Yes, a couple of the stories I was told about the 1950s was that men, particularly when they were living at home, and most men lived at home with their parents, because in those days, of course, people couldn't afford their own apartments. But when they received telephone calls from other homosexual men, and they didn't want their parents to know who was on the line, they often referred to the other person on the line as she, or used a female pseudonym. And I think that's really interesting in the sense that even nowadays, some gay men will refer to each other by female names. And I guess that the origin of that goes back to the fact that people did that in order to survive and basically not to be sent to jail. So there was a good reason for doing it in times past.
Okay, Jamie,
David,
stand up.
I'll make a speech too. So David, I've just been struck with the different periods you're talking about. We've added a 3rd period now, where it was closer to what David was describing, if not worse. And then things are liberal in the roaring 20s, where there's a sort of a relaxation morally. And then we come to the post-war period. But I was just thinking, in terms of the post-war period, it wasn't just in terms of how homosexual men were treated. That was the period of the Cold War and of reaction in general, trying to ban the Communist Party, low level of strike activity, women, the pressure on women to get back into the home, and that one must be very closely linked to treatment of homosexuals. So it was really, although different things can happen, I suppose this is quite a comment as far as the question, but it's also, it's not arbitrary. It's not random. It seems to me it's tied into the nature of society in that period. Wouldn't you say that?
Yes, very much the case. And I think if you think about the histories that we've written, the importance of these histories are that they tell us about ourselves. They tell us about Australian life. And of course, in telling those stories, it doesn't just tell the stories of homosexual men. As you say, it tells the story of how women were treated too. It tells the story of heterosexual laws and morals, etc. So, for example, heterosexuals in the 1940s and 50s basically couldn't have sex unless they were married, or at least those were the rules, whereas homosexual men were able to do so if they were had the freedom to know who they were. So the sorts of histories that we're talking about are histories that tell us about Australia, and the fact that Australia is not the egalitarian and easy-go-lucky type of history that we like to tell ourselves all the time. Sure, there were parts of Australian history that were like that, but there are other parts that simply that wasn't the case.
Other questions? Yes, over there somewhere. Yep. Yeah, sorry, yes. You're looking in all directions. Stand up.
Sorry. Yeah, it's a bit of an odd one, but did you ever, any of the buildings and the hotels that you found were popular beach spots or popular meetup spots, did you ever go looking for them where they are now or try and immerse yourself in what were there now, or had any of them survived? Because I doubt it, you know, given our big demolition spree of the 50s and 60s, I doubt a lot of them survived.
Yeah.
Your chance.
It's interesting. There are some sites still exist. Some sites do. You know, the big one, you know, the Hotel Australia went in the 1980s. But you know, one of the sites in the 20s and even during the war, there was a beat beside St Paul's Cathedral in the along there. It's called the Wailing Wall, because there was actually slightly after my time, but there was actually during the war there was actually a services canteen in the chapter house, in the basement of the chapter house next to St Paul's Cathedral. The idea was that, you know, the toilets in there were actually a beat. And someone did once say that, oh, you know, if you didn't actually succeed in the toilets in there, you'd actually go and stand out by the Wailing Wall and maybe get lucky there. Yeah, there are some buildings that have survived. Actually, what has survived more, a lot of beats were actually outdoors. So things like Fitzroy Gardens, Carlton Gardens, along St Kilda Road, Alexandra Gardens, yeah, they're still there. They're the ones that actually have survived, the outdoor spaces. There are some, and I like, you know, I always, when I'm walking around town, actually kind of like do try to immerse myself in what used to be there, and see what's survived.
If mainstream the Anglicans, I'll do the Catholics. There was a beach just near St Patrick's Cathedral. There's a small sort of verge behind it. I think nowadays it has a big, some sort of sculpture of a bow.
Women's vote.
Oh, the petition.
Yes.
Yeah, the petition.
And I think nowadays that particular beach or toilet is under the ground, so it's all been filled in, but I think it's still there. And that bit was actually called the flower pot. And the reason for that, I was told by one of my men, was that in one of the toilets, somebody had painted geraniums or roses. And so that became known as the flower pot. And it was a very well-known beach amongst homosexual men. And afterwards they went to church and asked for forgiveness. I made that up.
Not allowed to make things up. Yes.
So in both periods, how adaptable were the men post-release from police, prison, etc.? Because today we have primary care communities.
Yeah.
I did follow some of the cases that I looked at. A lot of men had one run-in with the police and then never again. You know, what you'll actually find is it's the record of their court hearing, and if they were convicted, not you know, a lot of them got good behaviour bonds and therefore, you know, basically paid their money up and disappeared out of the system. But if they were actually convicted and went to prison, they've got a prison register, huge folios, one person per page, and I've looked at every single one for, you know, 80 years. And it's every time they've gone back into the system. So a lot of guys had one run-in with the police and then they disappear out of the system, never to re-offend. But I found one guy, he was arrested in 1925 for gross indecency, and his prison register goes, and they're actually only meant to be held for 75 years, except his first appearance was 1925, but his last appearance was 1950. But the first one was gross indecency, and then every other case after that